Today we are going over the craziest things that happened in ancient civilizations. Grab some popcorn, sit down and enjoy. First, we are starting with the craziest laws from ancient civilizations. Your city feels normal until it suddenly isn't. A man is executed for something he didn't do. A father can legally kill his own child. A soldier is beaten to death over a single animal. And somewhere, a newborn's fate is decided in seconds. This isn't chaos. This is the law. Let's go back and see how it got this crazy.
Number 1. Babylon. If your house kills someone, your son dies. It's 1750 BC in ancient Babylon, and King Hammurabi has a problem. His empire is massive, stretching across most of Mesopotamia, and he needs a way to keep everyone in line. Different cities have different customs, different rules, different ideas about what's fair. So Hammurabi does something that no ruler before him had ever done on this scale. He writes it all down. He creates a code of 282 laws, covering everything from business disputes to marriage contracts to medical malpractice. And he doesn't write them on paper or a scroll that could be lost. He carves them into an 8-foot-tall pillar of black stone called a stele and plants it in the center of the city for everyone to see. This thing still exists, by the way. You can go look at it in the Louvre in Paris right now. It's been sitting there for nearly 4,000 years. Now, the Code of Hammurabi is famous for establishing the concept of an eye for an eye. If you break someone's bone, your bone gets broken. If you blind someone, you get blinded. Straightforward enough. But Hammurabi took this concept and cranked it up to a level that makes absolutely no sense to a modern person. Take Law 229. If a builder constructs a house and that house collapses and kills the owner, the builder is put to death. Okay, that's harsh, but there's a certain logic to it. Bad construction, someone dies, you pay with your life. But here's where it gets insane. Law 230 says that if the house collapses and kills the owner's son, it's not the builder who gets executed. It's the builder's son, his completely innocent child who had nothing to do with any of it. The logic, if you can call it that, was that justice meant the punishment had to mirror the crime exactly. You lost a son? The person responsible loses a son. Didn't matter that the builder's kid had literally never touched a brick in his life. The punishment was designed to match the grief, not the guilt. And it didn't stop there. If the collapse killed the owner's slave, the builder had to pay the replacement value of the slave. Because apparently, in ancient Babylon, killing someone's slave was a property crime, not a murder. If a doctor performed surgery and the patient died, the doctor's hands were cut off. Good luck performing any more surgeries after that. If you accused someone of a crime and couldn't prove it, you were executed instead. Imagine how quickly Twitter would empty out if that law existed today. The entire code reads like it was written by someone who fundamentally understood the concept of fairness, but then took it to the most extreme and literal conclusion possible. It's justice with absolutely no room for context, nuance, or mercy. And people lived under these laws for centuries. Number 2. Ancient Rome. You could legally kill your entire family. In ancient Rome, there was a legal concept called patria potestas, which translates to power of the father. And it meant exactly what it sounds like. The oldest male in a Roman family had absolute, unrestricted legal authority over every single member of his household. His wife, his children, his grandchildren, his slaves. All of them were legally his property. And when I say absolute authority, I mean he could do literally anything. He could sell his children into slavery. He could arrange their marriages and cancel them at will. He could confiscate any money or property they earned or inherited. And yes, he could execute them. His own children, his own grandchildren, legally. No trial, no justification needed. If the father decided his adult son had been disobedient or had brought shame to the family, he could have him killed, and the state would not intervene. Now, to be fair, by the later Republic and Empire periods, actually killing your kids was considered extremely bad form. Society would judge you harshly for it. But the legal right never went away. It stayed on the books for over 1,000 years. Think about that. For a millennium, every Roman child grew up knowing that their father, technically, legally, had the right to end their life at any point. The most famous example comes from Emperor Augustus himself. When his daughter Julia was caught having multiple affairs, which in fairness was also a crime under Augustus's own morality laws that he had literally just passed, Augustus used his power as her father to banish her to a tiny island called Pandataria. She was forbidden from drinking wine, seeing visitors, or leaving. She lived out the rest of her days in what was essentially solitary confinement. And this was considered the merciful option because he could have just had her killed. Even Augustus's successor Tiberius kept Julia in exile, eventually moving her to an even more remote location where she reportedly starved to death. All perfectly legal under Patria Potestas. Dad said so. The law was finally softened under later emperors, but it wasn't fully abolished until the reign of Justinian in the 6th century AD. That means Roman fathers had legal kill rights over their families for roughly 1,000 years. Makes "because I said so" hit a little different. Number 3. Ancient Egypt. Killing a cat was punishable by death. Ancient Egyptians loved their cats. And I don't mean the way your aunt loves her cats. I mean they worshipped them. Literally. Cats were considered sacred animals associated with the goddess Bastet, the goddess of home, fertility, and protection. Bastet was typically depicted as a woman with the head of a cat, and her temples were filled with thousands of mummified cats that had been given full burial rites. Harming a cat in ancient Egypt was one of the worst things you could possibly do, and killing one, even by accident, was punishable by death. This wasn't just a law on paper either. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, who visited Egypt around 60 BC, wrote about witnessing a Roman soldier accidentally kill a cat. A mob formed almost instantly. Despite the fact that Egypt was desperate to maintain good relations with Rome, who at this point basically controlled their economy, the crowd dragged the Roman soldier into the street and beat him to death. The Egyptian government didn't intervene. They let it happen. Think about what that means. Egypt was effectively a client state of Rome. Killing a Roman citizen could have been an act of war, and the Egyptians were like, yeah, but he killed a cat, so... Relations between the two nations were apparently strained for a while after this, but Egypt never apologized. The cat thing was non-negotiable. When a household cat died of natural causes, the entire family would shave off their eyebrows as a sign of mourning. They'd remain in mourning until their eyebrows fully grew back. The dead cat would be mummified, sometimes wrapped in linen and decorated with painted faces, and buried in special cemeteries. Archaeologists have found cat cemeteries in Egypt containing hundreds of thousands of mummified cats. One site at Beni Hassan contained an estimated 300,000 cat mummies. The Egyptians were also terrified that their enemies would figure out this weakness. During one battle, the Persian king Cambyses II allegedly ordered his soldiers to carry cats on their shields as they charged the Egyptian lines. The Egyptians supposedly refused to fight back because they were afraid of accidentally hurting the cats. Whether that story is entirely true is debated, but the fact that it was even considered a plausible military strategy tells you everything you need to know about how serious the Egyptians were about their cats. Don't touch the cats. It's really that simple. Number 4. Ancient Sparta. If your baby was weak, it was thrown off a cliff. Sparta was not a normal place. Every aspect of Spartan society was built around one single purpose: creating the most effective fighting force the world had ever seen. And that process started at birth. When a Spartan baby was born, it wasn't taken home by its parents. It was taken to a council of elders called the Gerousia for inspection. The elders would examine the newborn for any signs of weakness, too small, too sickly, any kind of deformity. If the baby passed inspection, it was handed back to its parents to be raised as a Spartan citizen. If it didn't pass, it was carried to a place called the Apothete, a chasm at the base of Mount Taygetus, and thrown in. No exceptions, no appeals. Didn't matter if you were a farmer's kid or the king's own child. Every Spartan baby had to pass the same inspection. The philosopher Plutarch, who wrote extensively about Spartan customs, described it as a matter of simple logic from the Spartan perspective. A child that was not healthy enough to become a warrior was not healthy enough to live. Raising a weak child was seen as a waste of resources and a burden on a state that could not afford burdens. Now, some modern historians have pushed back on this, arguing that the accounts may have been exaggerated by non-Spartan writers who wanted to make Sparta seem barbaric. Archaeological surveys of the Apothete have found bones, but they were adult bones, possibly criminals or prisoners, not infants. So the cliff-tossing part might be embellished. But even the more conservative interpretations agree that Spartans practiced some form of infant selection. Weak babies were at minimum abandoned or left exposed to the elements, which amounts to the same thing, with fewer dramatic cliffs. What's undeniable is that every Spartan boy who survived this initial inspection was placed into the agoge at age 7, a state-run training program that was basically a 13-year boot camp designed to turn children into professional killing machines. They were deliberately underfed to encourage them to steal food, and then beaten if they got caught. Not beaten for stealing, beaten for getting caught. The lesson wasn't don't steal. The lesson was don't get caught. Spartan parenting was a different vibe. Number 5. Ancient Athens. You could vote to banish anyone for 10 years. Athens is famous for inventing democracy. What most people don't know is that Athenian democracy came with one of the strangest and most ruthless political tools in history, ostracism. Once a year, the citizens of Athens held a special vote. No candidates, no proposals. Just one question. Is there anyone in this city who's gotten a little too powerful, a little too popular, or a little too annoying? If at least 6,000 citizens voted yes, a second vote was held. Every citizen would take a piece of broken pottery, called an ostraca, and scratch the name of the person they wanted gone. Whoever got the most votes was exiled from Athens for 10 years. No trial, no chance to defend yourself, no crime needed to have been committed. Just vibes. You could be the most upstanding citizen in Athens, never broken a single law, and if enough of your neighbors decided they didn't like you, or worse, that you were becoming too influential, you were gone. Pack your bags, see you in a decade. The original purpose of ostracism was actually pretty reasonable. Athens had just overthrown a series of tyrants, and they were terrified of anyone accumulating too much power again. Ostracism was supposed to be a safety valve, a way to peacefully remove a potential tyrant before they became an actual tyrant. And for a while,
It worked exactly as intended. Several genuinely dangerous politicians were ostracized before they could seize power. But pretty quickly, it became a political weapon. Rival factions would organize mass voting campaigns against their opponents. Popular generals who had just won major battles would come home to find out they'd been voted into exile because their popularity threatened someone in the assembly. Aristides, who was widely considered one of the most honorable men in Athens, was ostracized in 482 BC, essentially for being too virtuous. People were literally sick of hearing about how great he was. And here's the best part. Archaeologists digging in the Athenian agora found a pile of ostraca, those pottery shards, with the same name written on them in the same handwriting, which means somebody was handing out pre-filled ballots. Ancient voter fraud. Democracy has apparently always been kind of messy. One famous story involves Aristides himself on the day of his ostracism vote. An illiterate citizen who didn't recognize him approached and asked Aristides to write a name on his pottery shard for him. "Whose name should I write?" Aristides asked. "Aristides," the man replied. "Why? Has he wronged you in some way?" The man shook his head. "No, I'm just sick of hearing everyone call him the Just." Aristides smiled, wrote his own name on the shard, and handed it back. That's either the most dignified or the most depressing moment in the history of democracy. Probably both. So there you have it. 5 ancient civilizations, 5 sets of laws that make our modern legal system look downright reasonable by comparison. Babylon punished you through your children. Rome let your dad kill you. Egypt would murder you over a cat. Sparta threw your baby off a cliff. And Athens could exile you because enough people thought you were annoying. And honestly, at least one of those would probably still get majority support if you put it to a vote today. I'll let you guess which one. Next up, every drug used in ancient civilizations, and I'm not talking about herbal tea and chamomile.
I'm talking about the hard stuff, the substances that entire empires ran on, that religions were built around, and that may have literally shaped the course of Western philosophy. Turns out our ancestors were way more familiar with getting high than most history books would like you to believe. Let's get into it. Number 1. Opium, the joy plant. It's roughly 3,400 BC in ancient Sumer, modern-day Iraq, and the Sumerians have discovered something wonderful. They've been cultivating a flower, the poppy, and they figured out that if you slice open the seed pod and collect the milky sap that oozes out, you get a substance that makes pain disappear and fills you with a warm, dreamy euphoria. They call it hul gil, the joy plant. And with that, humanity's longest and most complicated relationship with a drug begins. The Sumerians didn't keep this discovery to themselves. They passed their knowledge of opium cultivation to the Assyrians, who passed it to the Babylonians, who passed it to the Egyptians. By 1300 BC, opium was being mass-produced in the poppy fields of Egypt and traded across the entire ancient world. And everybody loved it. Egyptian mothers would rub opium paste on their gums to stop their babies from crying, which, it definitely worked. Egyptian doctors prescribed it for basically everything: headaches, surgery, insomnia, depression. They ground it into a paste, mixed it into drinks, and even shaped it into suppositories. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts in existence, contains over 700 remedies, and opium shows up in a shocking number of them. When the Greeks got their hands on opium, they ran with it. Greek soldiers took it before battle to dull the fear of death.
Homer mentions it in the Odyssey. Helen of Troy drops a drug into wine that quieted all pain and strife and brought forgetfulness of every ill. Most scholars believe she was spiking the wine with opium. The Greek god of sleep, Hypnos, was depicted holding poppies. The god of dreams, Morpheus, whose name we literally get the word morphine from, was surrounded by them. And then there were the Romans. Roman emperors were straight-up addicts. Marcus Aurelius, one of the most celebrated philosophers in human history, took opium daily. His personal physician Galen prescribed it to him, and Marcus spent his evenings writing some of the most profound philosophical texts ever produced while absolutely zonked on opiates. His Meditations, a book still assigned in university philosophy courses today, was written by a man who was probably high while writing it, which honestly explains why some of it reads the way it does. The really wild part is that for roughly 4,000 years, nobody considered opium a problem. There was no concept of addiction, no war on drugs, no moral panic. It was just medicine. Good medicine that made you feel incredible. It took until the 19th century for anyone to seriously start questioning whether maybe, just maybe, a substance that makes you feel like a god every time you take it might have some downsides. Number 2. Blue Lotus, the party drug of the pharaohs. It's around 1500 BC in ancient Egypt, and the elite are throwing a party. But they're not drinking regular wine. They've taken the petals of a beautiful blue water lily, Nymphaea cerulea, commonly known as the blue lotus, and soaked them in wine for several hours. The result is a drink that acts as a sedative, an aphrodisiac, and a mild hallucinogen all at the same time. It's basically ancient Egypt's version of a cocktail that does everything. Blue lotus was everywhere in Egyptian culture, and I mean everywhere. It's painted on tomb walls, carved into temple pillars, depicted in banquet scenes, shown being held up to people's noses at parties. When archaeologists opened the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922, they found dried blue lotus petals scattered across his body. This wasn't some obscure recreational drug. This was a central part of Egyptian social and religious life. The effects of blue lotus are pretty interesting from a pharmacological standpoint. The flower contains two main psychoactive compounds, nuciferine and apomorphine. Nuciferine is a sedative that produces a calm, floating sensation. Apomorphine activates dopamine receptors, creating feelings of euphoria and heightened sensual awareness. Combined with alcohol in wine, the result is a warm, dreamy, mildly psychedelic state that the Egyptians associated with divine connection. Egyptian priests used blue lotus as part of religious ceremonies, claiming it allowed them to communicate with the gods. And given what we now know about its psychoactive properties, they were probably having some genuinely interesting experiences.
Temple rituals involving blue lotus wine were considered sacred, and depictions of the flower appear alongside Osiris and other gods of the afterlife. Cleopatra, according to some historical accounts, allegedly bathed in pools infused with blue lotus. Whether that's actually true or just the kind of story that gets attached to someone like Cleopatra is hard to say. But it fits. The whole Egyptian upper class was soaking in this stuff. And here the fun fact, blue lotus is still legal in most countries today. You can buy it online. You can brew it into tea. Nobody really regulates it because it's technically just a flower. The ancient Egyptians' favorite party drug is available on Amazon. Welcome to the future. Number 3. Soma, the mystery drug. Sometime around 1500 BC in ancient India, priests of the Vedic religion are performing their most sacred ritual. At the center of this ritual is a drink called soma, pressed from a plant, filtered through sheep's wool, mixed with milk and honey, and consumed by the priests who then enter states of ecstatic divine communion. Soma is mentioned 114 times in the Rig Veda, one of the oldest religious texts in human history. An entire book of the Rig Veda, the 9th Mandala, is dedicated exclusively to Soma. Hymns describe it as granting immortality, divine visions, superhuman strength, and communion with the gods. One verse reads, "We have drunk Soma and become immortal. We have attained the light the gods discovered." This wasn't just a drug. This was the centerpiece of an entire religion. And here's the problem. Nobody knows what it was. The identity of Soma is one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in the history of religion and botany. The original plant went extinct, or the knowledge of which plant to use was lost, or the trade routes that supplied it dried up. Nobody's sure. By the time later Hindu texts were written, Soma had already become mythological rather than practical. The priests knew they were supposed to use Soma, but they no longer knew what Soma actually was. This has not stopped people from guessing. In 1968, a banker and amateur mycologist named R. Gordon Wasson published a book arguing that Soma was Amanita muscaria, the red and white spotted mushroom that looks like something out of a Mario game. His theory was that the mushroom's psychoactive properties matched the Rig Veda's descriptions of divine visions and feelings of invincibility. Other scholars have proposed ephedra, a stimulant plant that grows in the region and would explain the descriptions of superhuman energy. Some suggest it was a combination of plants, maybe a psychedelic mixed with a stimulant, that produced effects no single plant could replicate. Others have gone even more exotic, suggesting Syrian rue, cannabis, or plants that no longer exist in their original form. The truth is, we may never know. The most important drug in ancient religious history, a substance that an entire civilization built their spiritual practice around, and its identity is a complete mystery. Somewhere out there is a plant that made people feel like gods, and we lost it. Number 4, henbane, the berserker drug. It's the 9th century AD somewhere in Scandinavia, and a band of Viking warriors is preparing for battle. But these aren't regular warriors. These men have stripped naked, painted themselves, and are currently biting their own shields while howling like animals. Their eyes are dilated to the size of dinner plates. Some of them are foaming at the mouth. They feel no pain. They feel no fear. They are about to charge into an enemy army like rabid wolves, and they cannot wait. These are the berserkers, the most feared warriors in the Viking world. And there's a growing theory that their legendary battle rage wasn't purely psychological. It was pharmacological. And the drug in question was henbane. Henbane, or Hyoscyamus niger, is a deliriant. Unlike hallucinogens, which distort reality, deliriants replace reality entirely. Users experience full-blown hallucinations that they cannot distinguish from the real world. They feel invincible. They feel no pain. And in many cases, they become extremely aggressive. The plant contains tropane alkaloids, hyoscyamine and scopolamine, that in the right doses produce exactly the kind of behavior described in the sagas. Uncontrollable rage, immunity to pain, superhuman strength, or at least the absolute conviction that you have superhuman strength, which, in a battle situation, amounts to the same thing. Some researchers have found henbane seeds in Viking graves and at settlement sites, suggesting it was widely available and commonly used. Norse shamans, called vulvas and seithmother, also used henbane in their rituals. They'd burn the seeds and inhale the smoke, or brew them into a drink, entering trance states where they believed they could travel between worlds. Celtic druids reportedly did the same. And here's where it gets really interesting. One of the side effects of henbane is the sensation of flying. Users consistently report feeling like they've left the ground and are soaring through the air. Some scholars have linked this directly to medieval witch legends, the idea of witches flying on broomsticks. The theory goes that so-called witches were actually women who had been using henbane-based ointments applied to the skin or to mucous membranes using a staff or stick. The flying sensation became the legend of witches on broomsticks. The broom was just the delivery mechanism. So a single plant may be responsible for both the most terrifying warriors in medieval history and the most enduring image of witchcraft. Not bad for a weed that grows in ditches. Number 5. Ergot, the fungus that built philosophy and burned witches. And finally, we arrive at perhaps the most consequential drug in ancient history. Not because it was the most powerful or the most popular, but because its influence may have shaped both the foundation of Western philosophy and one of the most infamous events in American history. This is ergot. Ergot is a fungus, Claviceps purpurea, that grows on grain, particularly rye. It produces dark, purplish-black growths called sclerotia that replace the grain kernels. If you eat contaminated bread or grain, the ergot alkaloids enter your bloodstream. And what happens next depends entirely on how much you consume. In small doses, ergot produces mild euphoria, vivid hallucinations, and a sense of profound spiritual connection. In larger doses, it causes violent convulsions, terrifying hallucinations, a burning sensation in the limbs, gangrene, and death. The chemical reason for this range of effects is that ergot contains lysergic acid, the same compound that Albert Hofmann would later synthesize into LSD in 1938. Ergot is, quite literally, natural acid. Now here's where it gets fascinating. In ancient Greece, the most sacred religious ceremony for nearly 2,000 years was the Eleusinian Mysteries. Every year, thousands of people would travel to the town of Eleusis, near Athens, to participate in a secret initiation ritual that reportedly produced life-changing mystical experiences. Participants drank a beverage called kykeon, made from barley, water, and mint. Barley is one of the grains most susceptible to ergot contamination. In 1978, scholars Albert Hofmann, yes, the same guy who invented LSD, along with R. Gordon Wasson and Carl Ruck, published a book arguing that kykeon was deliberately spiked with ergot. The priests at Eleusis, they argued, had figured out how to extract the psychoactive compounds from ergot while filtering out the toxic ones, creating a controlled psychedelic experience for initiates. The participant list for the Eleusinian Mysteries reads like a who's who of ancient philosophy. Plato participated, Socrates participated, Aristotle participated, Marcus Aurelius participated. All of them were sworn to absolute secrecy about what happened inside the ritual, on pain of death. Whatever they experienced was so profound that it influenced their entire philosophical worldview. And if the ergot theory is correct, it means that the foundational thinkers of Western civilization may have developed their ideas about the nature of reality, consciousness, and the divine while tripping on ancient LSD. Now, fast forward about 2,000 years to 1692 in Salem, Massachusetts. A group of young girls begin having violent seizures, screaming about invisible tormentors, hallucinating demons, and contorting their bodies in ways that terrify the deeply religious Puritan community. The townspeople conclude that the girls have been bewitched. The Salem witch trials begin. 20 people are executed. In 1976, behavioral psychologist Linda Caporail published a paper arguing that the girls of Salem weren't bewitched at all. They were suffering from ergot poisoning. The rye crop in Salem that year had been grown in a warm, damp environment, perfect conditions for ergot contamination. The symptoms described in trial records, convulsions, hallucinations, the sensation of being pricked by invisible pins, the feeling of ants crawling under the skin, are a near-perfect match for ergotism. Not everyone agrees with this theory, and there are valid counterarguments. But the possibility remains that a single fungus growing on grain may have been responsible for both the philosophical enlightenment of ancient Greece's greatest minds and the execution of 20 innocent people in colonial Massachusetts. A fungus that inspired Plato and killed witches. You can't make this stuff up. So there you have it. 5 ancient drugs that shaped civilizations in ways we're still only beginning to understand. Opium ran the ancient world for 4,000 years before anyone noticed it was a problem. Blue lotus was ancient Egypt's favorite party favor. Soma was so important they built a religion around it and then lost it. Henbane may have created the berserkers and the myth of flying witches. And ergot might have given us both Western philosophy and the Salem witch trials. And honestly, after researching all of this, the thing that surprised me most isn't that ancient people used drugs. It's that they used this many drugs, this effectively, for this long, and we just kind of forgot about it. History class really left some stuff out.
The next one I'll just let you enjoy.
Today we're going over ancient technologies that we still can't fully explain. And I don't mean like, oh, that's kind of interesting. I mean inventions and constructions from thousands of years ago that modern scientists, with all our fancy labs and supercomputers, still look at and go, how the hell did they do that? Some of these are so advanced that they shouldn't exist, and yet, here they are. Let's start with the big ones. Number 1, the Antikythera mechanism. It's the year 1901, and a group of Greek sponge divers are exploring a shipwreck off the coast of the island of Antikythera. The ship went down around 65 BC, and down there, among the barnacle-covered statues and corroded amphoras, they find a lump of corroded bronze that nobody thinks twice about. It gets thrown into a box with the rest of the artifacts and sits in a museum for months. Then one day, an archaeologist notices something unusual. The lump has cracked open, and inside are what appear to be tiny bronze gears. Dozens of them. Interlocking. Precision cut. In a device that is over 2,000 years old. What they had found was essentially an analog computer. The Antikythera mechanism contained at least 30 bronze gears arranged in a complex system that could predict solar and lunar eclipses, track the positions of the 5 known planets, calculate the dates of the Olympic Games, and model the irregular orbit of the moon, something that requires insanely advanced mathematics. Let me put this in perspective. After this device was built, humanity would not create anything even remotely this mechanically complex for another 1,400 years. That's like if someone found a working laptop in a Viking burial mound. It just shouldn't be there, and yet it is. Scientists have spent over a century studying this thing with X-rays, CT scans, and 3D modeling, and they still haven't been able to fully replicate it. We know what it does. We mostly know how it works. But the precision of the gears, the sophistication of the astronomical models, and the sheer ambition of cramming all of that into a device the size of a shoebox, that part still blows people's minds. Whoever built this was operating on a level that the rest of the world wouldn't catch up to until the Renaissance. And here's what's really wild. This was found in a shipwreck, meaning it was being transported somewhere, which means this wasn't some one-of-a-kind miracle. Somebody was just casually shipping this thing across the Mediterranean like it was no big deal. How many more of these existed? How many are sitting at the bottom of the ocean right now? Number 2, Greek fire. It's 672 AD, and a massive Arab fleet is bearing down on Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. The Arabs have been conquering everything in their path, and now they've brought hundreds of ships to finally take the jewel of the eastern Mediterranean. The Byzantines are outnumbered, and things are looking grim. Then, the Byzantine ships sail out to meet the fleet and unleash something the Arabs have never seen before. Liquid fire, projected from tubes mounted on the bows of their ships that sprays across the water like a flamethrower. But unlike normal fire, this stuff doesn't go out. It burns on the surface of the water. Sailors who jump overboard to escape are consumed by flames that follow them into the sea. Entire ships are engulfed in seconds. The Arab fleet is decimated. This was Greek fire, and it was the Byzantine Empire's ultimate weapon for nearly 800 years. They used it to repel invasion after invasion, and it was so effective that enemy fleets would sometimes turn around and flee at the mere rumor that Greek fire ships were nearby. But here's the thing, nobody knows what it was made of. The formula for Greek fire was the most closely guarded state secret in Byzantine history. Only a handful of people at any given time knew the recipe, and they were sworn to take it to their graves. When Constantinople fell in 1453, the secret died with the empire. Modern chemists have been trying to figure it out for centuries. The leading theories involve some combination of petroleum, pine resin, sulfur, quicklime, and possibly saltpeter. But nobody has been able to create a substance that matches all the historical descriptions. A liquid that could be sprayed through tubes, that ignited on contact with water, that stuck to surfaces and couldn't be extinguished. Some of those properties actively contradict each other from a chemistry standpoint, which is part of why it remains such a mystery. The Byzantines took one of the most powerful weapons in human history and erased it from existence. That's either the greatest act of military secrecy ever, or the biggest fumble in the history of technology. Maybe both. Number 3. Damascus steel. Sometime in the early Middle Ages, swordsmiths in the Middle East began producing blades that were unlike anything the world had ever seen. They called it Damascus steel, and the swords made from it were legendary. These blades could cut through European swords like they were made of tin. They could slice a falling silk scarf clean in half. The blade was so sharp and the edge so fine that the fabric's own weight was enough to split it. When you looked at the surface of a Damascus steel blade, you'd see these distinctive swirling patterns that looked like flowing water. It wasn't decorative. Those patterns were a byproduct of the forging process itself, and they were a sign that the internal structure of the metal was something special. Fast forward to 2006. Scientists at a German university put fragments of a genuine Damascus steel blade under an electron microscope and found something that made their jaws hit the floor. The metal contained carbon nanotubes, cylindrical structures of carbon atoms arranged at the molecular level that are among the strongest materials known to science. We discovered carbon nanotubes in 1991 and consider them cutting-edge nanotechnology. Medieval blacksmiths were forging them into swords 800 years earlier. The problem is that nobody knows exactly how they did it. The technique was lost around 1750, when the specific ores used in production ran out or trade routes shifted. Blacksmiths have been trying to recreate true Damascus steel ever since, and while some have come close, nobody has been able to produce a blade that matches the originals in both structure and performance. The carbon nanotubes appear to have formed accidentally through some quirk of the specific ores and forging temperatures used, but reproducing that accident on purpose has proven basically impossible. We can build particle accelerators and land robots on Mars, but we cannot make a sword as good as some guy in a workshop in the 12th century. Number 4. Roman concrete. The Pantheon in Rome was built in 125 AD. It has the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world. It has stood for nearly 2,000 years through earthquakes, floods, wars, and the general passage of time. It's still standing right now. You can go visit it. Meanwhile, modern concrete, the stuff we use to build highways and parking garages, starts crumbling after about 50 years. We literally pour billions of dollars into concrete maintenance every year because the stuff we make today can't hold a candle to what the Romans were mixing with their bare hands 2 millennia ago. For centuries, nobody could figure out why Roman concrete was so much more durable. The recipe was known: volcanic ash, seawater, lime, but nobody could explain why it got stronger over time instead of weaker. Then, in 2023, scientists at MIT finally cracked part of the mystery. They discovered that Roman concrete contains tiny white chunks of lime called lime clasts that were previously thought to be imperfections. Turns out they're not imperfections at all. When cracks form in the concrete and water seeps in, these lime clasts dissolve and recrystallize, essentially filling in the cracks automatically. Roman concrete self-heals. The material literally repairs itself when damaged. The Romans accidentally or deliberately created a construction material with built-in maintenance that activates when exposed to water, which is why their harbors and aqueducts have lasted so long. Seawater, which destroys modern concrete, actually makes Roman concrete stronger. Scientists are now actively trying to reverse engineer this for modern construction, but mass-producing it has proven incredibly difficult. The specific volcanic ash the Romans used came from a particular region of Italy and has chemical properties that are hard to replicate with modern materials. So for now, the Pantheon just sits there in Rome, quietly flexing on every building constructed in the last century. Number 5. The Nazca Lines. Sometime around 500 BC, the Nazca people of southern Peru walked out into the desert and started drawing. Not small drawings, enormous drawings. A spider that stretches 150 feet across, a monkey with a spiraling tail that spans over 300 feet, a hummingbird, a condor. Geometric shapes and straight lines extending for miles across the desert floor. Some of these figures are over 1,200 feet long. And here's the thing that gets everyone. They're only really visible from the air. From the ground, you'd barely notice them. They look like random paths scratched into the dirt. But from a few hundred feet up, they resolve into these incredibly precise, perfectly proportioned images. The Nazca people did not have aircraft. They did not have hot air balloons. They did not have any known technology that would allow them to see their own work from above. And yet the proportions are so accurate that they appear to have been designed to be viewed from the sky. How did they do it? The honest answer is, we're not entirely sure. The most accepted theory involves using small-scale drawings and a grid system of stakes and ropes to scale them up, kind of like projecting a sketch onto a massive canvas. And experiments have shown this is possible. But doing it across miles of open desert with this level of precision, using rope and stakes, that's still impressive enough to make you pause. There are over 800 straight lines, 300 geometric figures, and 70 animal and plant designs spread across 170 square miles of desert. The Nazca carved them by removing the reddish pebbles on the surface to reveal the lighter ground beneath. The dry, windless desert has preserved them for over 2,000 years. New ones are still being discovered. In 2020, a new cat figure was found during conservation work. It had been sitting there for 2 millennia, and nobody had noticed. Now for the supporting cast. These are a little shorter, but equally mind-bending. The Baghdad Battery. Around 250 BC, somebody in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, created a series of small clay jars with copper cylinders and iron rods inside. When scientists filled a replica with vinegar or grape juice, it produced about 1.1 volts of electricity. 1,800 years before Alessandro Volta invented the battery. Now, some scholars argue it was just a storage vessel, and the electrical properties are coincidental. But the design is suspiciously specific for a jar. You don't accidentally assemble copper, iron, and an electrolyte in that exact configuration. The Lycurgus cup. A Roman glass cup from the 4th century AD that changes color depending on how you look at it. Green in reflected light, blood red when lit from behind. For centuries, nobody could explain how the Romans pulled this off. Then scientists analyzed the glass and found it contained gold and silver nanoparticles at 50 nanometers in diameter. That's nanotechnology. Deliberate, precise nanotechnology embedded in a drinking cup from ancient Rome. The color change is caused by the way light interacts with these metallic nanoparticles, a phenomenon we only understood in the 20th century. Whether the Romans stumbled onto this by accident or actually understood what they were doing is still hotly debated. but the fact that they could reproduce it reliably enough to make a finished product suggests it wasn't just a happy accident. The walls of Sacsayhuaman. High in the Andes above Cusco, Peru, the Inca built a fortress with walls made of limestone blocks weighing up to 130 tons each. These blocks are fitted together so precisely that you cannot slide a piece of paper between them. No mortar, no cement. Just stone on stone, interlocking like a 3D puzzle. And the whole structure has survived over 500 years of earthquakes in one of the most seismically active regions on the planet. We have no solid explanation for how they cut stones this precisely with the tools available to them, let alone how they transported 130-ton blocks up a mountain. The Voynich Manuscript. Sometime in the early 1400s, someone wrote a 240-page book in a language that has never been identified. The pages are filled with illustrations of unknown plants that don't match any known species, astronomical charts, and, for reasons nobody can explain, drawings of naked women bathing in green pools connected by an elaborate plumbing system. Every major codebreaker from World War II cryptographers to the NSA to modern AI has taken a crack at deciphering it. All of them have failed. The text shows consistent linguistic patterns that suggest it's a real language, not gibberish. But nobody can read a single word of it. It just sits in Yale University's library. 240 pages of absolute mystery. And finally, Pumapunku, a temple complex in Bolivia sitting at 12,800 feet above sea level. The site contains H-shaped stone blocks that look like they were cut by machines. Perfectly flat surfaces accurate to fractions of a millimeter.
Fill holes that are completely uniform in diameter. Interlocking pieces that fit together with the precision of Lego bricks. All carved from andesite and diorite, two of the hardest stones on Earth, by a civilization that had no iron tools, no steel, and no writing system that we know of. The precision is so extreme that modern engineers have said they'd struggle to replicate it with today's equipment. So there you have it, 10 ancient technologies that our ancestors created thousands of years ago that we either can't explain, can't replicate, or both. The Antikythera mechanism is an ancient computer we can't rebuild. Greek fire is a weapon we can't recreate. Damascus steel contains nanotubes we only discovered 30 years ago. And Roman concrete self-heals in a way that makes everything we build today look embarrassing. Makes you wonder what else has been lost. How many discoveries were made, used, and then forgotten over the centuries? How much did ancient civilizations know that we're only now beginning to figure out again? I don't know. But maybe the next time we find a weird lump of bronze in a shipwreck, we should probably take a closer look. Next up is every ancient weapon that was insanely far ahead of their time. Every weapon on this list is invented by someone who looks at the technology of their entire era and decides it isn't good enough. A few of these machines are built so far ahead of schedule that the rest of the world needs 1,000 years to catch up. Some of them are so good they get reinvented from scratch centuries later by people who have no idea they are copying the dead. These are 10 weapons that should not exist when they do. Repeating crossbow. It's around 228 AD in the mountains of northern China, and a strategist named Zhuge Liang has a math problem. He commands the armies of Shu, the smallest and poorest of the three kingdoms, tearing the country apart. He is outnumbered in almost every fight he walks into. A normal crossbow is powerful, but it is slow. You shoot once, then you brace the bow against the ground, haul the string back with both hands or a hook on your belt, drop in a bolt, raise it, aim, fire. In the time it takes one man to do that, a charging enemy covers a lot of ground. So Zhuge Liang takes a weapon that already exists and makes it monstrous. The repeating crossbow, the Zhuge Nu, has a wooden magazine sitting on top of the stock. You load it with 10 bolts, stacked. There is a single lever on the back. You push the lever forward. It drops a bolt into the channel. You pull the lever back, it draws the string, and at the end of the pull, it trips the release and fires. Push, pull, push, pull. One hand, no aiming, no bracing, no thinking. A soldier can empty all 10 bolts in about 15 seconds. Here is the catch. Each bolt is small and weak. On its own, it barely punches through padded cloth. So they fix that the medieval way. They smear the tips in aconite, wolfsbane, what the Chinese call tiger poison. Now, the wound doesn't have to be deep. It just has to break skin. Picture 100 of these on a wall, every man pumping a lever, throwing up a curtain of poisoned bolts that never stops, never reloads, never gives you a gap to advance into. And the wildest part is that Zhuge Liang doesn't actually invent it. He gets the credit, but archaeologists pull a repeating crossbow out of a tomb in Hubei from the 4th century BC, more than 500 years before he is born. He just perfects the idea. The design is so practical that Chinese soldiers are still carrying repeating crossbows into the Sino-Japanese War in 1894, firing the same push-pull machine more than 2,000 years after someone first buried one in the ground. Hand crossbow trigger systems. It's around 210 BC, and a bronze caster in a state armory is holding a piece of machinery so precise it will not be matched in Europe for over 1,000 years. The crossbow is only as good as the thing that holds the string. The problem with a powerful crossbow is the tension. You draw back enough force to punch through armor at 200 paces, and now that energy is sitting there, desperate to release. You need a mechanism that holds all of it perfectly still while a soldier takes his time and aims, then lets go of every bit of it the instant he barely twitches a finger. The Chinese solve this with a cast bronze trigger that is, mechanically, a small puzzle box. 3 interlocking pieces sit inside a bronze housing. One catches the string, one holds the first piece. The trigger lever holds the second. The genius is that the load is distributed across the parts so cleverly that a string pulling with hundreds of pounds of force is held by a finger pressure of almost nothing. Pull the lever and the whole chain collapses in sequence, releasing instantly. These are not hand-fitted one-offs. They are mass-produced in government workshops to standardize measurements, cast to tolerances of fractions of a millimeter, so that parts are interchangeable between weapons. This is industrial precision engineering happening in the 3rd century BC. The same triggers are found in the pits of the Terracotta Army, packed in beside Qin Shi Huang's clay soldiers. Then it gets absurd. Some Han triggers carry a graduated bronze sight, a little grid behind the bolt with marked increments. You line your target up against the grid lines to compensate for the drop of the bolt over distance. It is a ranging device, a mechanical aid for calculating trajectory, built into the weapon 2,000 years before anybody else thinks to bolt a calibrated sight onto a gun. A Han soldier is, in a real sense, aiming with a bronze ballistic computer that his enemies in the West would not understand if you handed it to them. Composite recurve bow. It's the year 1226 on the open grassland of Mongolia, and a man named Yi Sung-gae, a nephew of Genghis Khan, looses an arrow at a stone marker to celebrate a victory. The shot travels something like 500 meters. They are so impressed, they carve it into a stone slab that still exists, one of the oldest surviving examples of written Mongolian. A bow shot, recorded in granite, because nobody can believe a bow can do that. The reason it can is the bow itself. A normal wooden bow has a limit. Make it more powerful, and you have to make it longer. And a long bow is useless on horseback. The steppe peoples solved this by abandoning the idea that a bow should be made of one material. The composite recurve bow is a sandwich. On the back, the side facing the target, they glue layers of animal sinew, which is brilliant under stretching tension. On the belly, the side facing the archer, they glue strips of horn, which is brilliant under compression. A wooden core sits in the middle holding the shape. When you draw it, the sinew stretches and wants to snap back, the horn compresses and wants to spring out, and all of that stored energy slams into the arrow at release. The result is a bow shorter than your arm that hits harder than a wooden bow twice its size, short enough to fire from a galloping horse, in any direction, including backward over the rump in the famous Parthian shot. It is also a nightmare to build. The glue is boiled out of fish and animal hide. The layers have to be laminated and then left to cure, sometimes for more than a year, because if you rush it, the bow delaminates the first time you draw it. Humidity is the enemy. A wet morning can ruin a weapon that took 18 months to make. This thing is not new in 1226. Composite bows appear across Central Asia and the Near East by around 2000 BC. The Mongols just become the most terrifying people to ever pick one up, and they conquer the largest land empire in history with a weapon that is essentially horn, wood, sinew, and a year of patience. Atlatl spear thrower. It's roughly 30,000 years ago in Ice Age Europe, and a hunter is about to cheat physics with a stick. The atlatl is the oldest weapon on this list by a staggering margin, and it might be the simplest. It is a length of wood or bone, maybe half a meter long, with a hook or a cup at one end. You rest the butt of a light spear, a dart, against the hook. You hold the throwing stick and the dart together, you bring your arm back, and you throw. What the stick does is add a second joint to your arm. It extends your throwing leverage, multiplying the speed at the tip enormously. A bare human arm throws a spear at maybe 40 miles an hour. An atlatl can throw a dart well over 100 miles an hour and send it more than 100 meters. The dart even flexes in flight, bending and springing like a loaded spring, storing and releasing energy as it goes. People all over the planet figure this out independently, tens of thousands of years before the bow exists. The carved ones found in French caves are sculpted with animals on the handle, which means somebody had time to make their spear thrower beautiful. Now jump forward to 1519 when this supposedly primitive Stone Age tool meets the most advanced army on Earth. The Aztecs call it the atlatl, and when the Spanish conquistadors arrive in steel breastplates and helmets, feeling untouchable, the Aztec warriors raise their throwing sticks, and the darts punch through Spanish steel. Spanish accounts describe atlatl darts going clean through armor that arrows cannot dent. A weapon older than agriculture, older than the wheel, older than written language, is sitting in a museum of human invention casually defeating 16th century European plate. Some problems, it turns out, were solved completely the first time. Roman ballista. It's 52 BC at the Siege of Avaricum in Gaul, and a Gallic defender on the wall is about to be pinned to the wood behind him by a weapon he cannot even see firing. The ballista is the Roman answer to the question of how you throw something with the force of a god. The trick is torsion. Forget bending wood. The Romans take two thick skeins of twisted rope, usually sinew or hair, and wind them brutally tight inside a wooden frame. Each skein grips one throwing arm. When you crank the arms back, you twist those rope bundles even tighter, loading them with enormous stored energy. Release, and the arms whip forward and the projectile leaves the rails faster than the eye can follow. The smaller version, the Scorpio, is a bolt shooter, and the Romans assign roughly one to every group of 80 legionaries. It is essentially an artillery rifle. It fires a heavy iron-headed bolt with enough accuracy that a trained crew can hit a specific man on a wall 100 meters away, and enough force to drive that bolt through his shield, through him, and into whatever is behind him. Julius Caesar uses these constantly in Gaul. At Avaricum, the defenders learn that they cannot stand on their own walls, because an unseen crew somewhere below keeps reaching up and killing them one by one through their shields. The detail that should not be possible for the time is the calibration. The Romans work out that the power of a ballista depends on the diameter of the hole the torsion springs pass through. So they build to a standard. The engineer Vitruvius writes down formulas relating the weight of the stone you want to throw to the exact bore size of the machine. You tell the workshop the projectile weight, they build a machine tuned to it. Standardized, scalable, formula-driven artillery designed off written specifications in the 1st century BC. Counterweight trebuchet. It's the summer of 1304 outside Stirling Castle in Scotland, and King Edward I of England has built a machine so large the Scots inside the castle try to surrender before it is even finished. He says no. Edward has spent months and a fortune assembling a trebuchet he calls Warwolf, the largest of its kind ever built, big enough that 30 wagons are needed to haul the parts. When the defenders of Stirling, watching this thing rise, decide they have seen enough and offer to give up, Edward refuses to accept the surrender. He has not tested his new toy yet. He makes them stay inside while Warwolf throws stones that reportedly knock down an entire section of wall in single shots. The counterweight trebuchet is one of the most elegant weapons humans ever build, and it runs on nothing but gravity. You have a long arm on a pivot, unbalanced. The short end carries a colossal box of stone or lead weighing several tons. The long end carries a sling holding the projectile. You haul the long arm down and lock it, lifting the counterweight high. Then you release. The weight drops, the arm whips up and over. The sling adds a final acceleration at the end, and a stone the weight of a grown man flies 200 meters into a wall. Because gravity is constant, the machine is consistent. Crews can walk their shots in, landing stone after stone in nearly the same spot, until the masonry gives. And when stone gets boring, the trebuchet becomes the world's first machine for psychological and biological warfare. Armies fling severed heads back over the walls. They throw dead horses. During one siege, the attackers hurl plague-ridden corpses into the city to spread disease. A weapon driven entirely by a falling box of rocks, turned into a catapult for terror. Fire lances. It's 1132 at the Siege of Dian in China, and a Song commander named Chen Gui is about to point the ancestor of every gun ever made at the soldiers climbing his walls. By now, Chinese alchemists have been playing with gunpowder for a couple of centuries, mostly trying to make it explode. Chen Gui's people have a different idea. They take tubes, some bamboo, some rolled paper later reinforced, and pack them with gunpowder. They lash the tubes to the ends of spears. When the enemy gets close, you light the tube and it roars to life, throwing a jet of flame several feet long out of the end of your spear. This is the fire lance, and it is the single most important weapon on this list because it is the missing link. It is the moment the spear and gunpowder fuse into one object, and from that object, eventually, comes the gun. At first, it is pure fire, a flamethrower on a stick, meant to terrify men and set them alight in the brutal crush of a wall assault. But then, someone makes the leap that changes the planet. They start packing bits of pottery, sand, scrap iron, and pellets into the tube along with the powder. Now when it fires, it does not just spit flame, it spits shrapnel. It launches projectiles downrange with the blast. The instant a Chinese soldier loads pellets into a fire lance and points it at another human being, the firearm exists in embryo. Shorten the tube, make it metal, stop adding flame, and start adding a single tight-fitting projectile. And you have a hand cannon. Every rifle, pistol, and cannon in human history traces its bloodline back to a man on a wall in 12th century China, holding a paper tube of fire. Early military rockets. It's 1232 at the Siege of Kaifeng, and the Jin defenders fighting for their lives against the Mongols fire weapons their enemies describe as arrows of flying fire. These are real rockets. The Chinese take the gunpowder tube and realize they do not need a bow at all. If you seal one end of a powder tube and leave the other open, the escaping gases push the tube forward. Strap that tube to an arrow, light it, and it flies itself, screaming and burning with no archer required. At Kaifeng, these flying fire arrows streak into the Mongol ranks, and the Mongols, who have seen most of the world by this point, are unnerved. The terror is half the weapon. A volley of shrieking, smoking arrows that launch themselves is a nightmare to men who have never met one. Then Chinese engineers get ambitious in ways that feel like science fiction for the period. They build launchers, called wasp nests, that fire dozens of rockets at once from a single basket, saturating an area. And in their military manuals, they describe a weapon called the fire dragon, issuing from the water, a rocket that carries smaller rockets inside it. The big rocket boosts the whole assembly out over the water, and when it burns out, the smaller rockets ignite and fly on toward the target. That is a multi-stage rocket. The exact principle that 7 centuries later lifts human beings off this planet and onto the moon, sketched out in a 14th century Chinese handbook by men who wanted to set enemy boats on fire from a distance. Corvus boarding Divus. It's 260 BC off the coast of Sicily at the Battle of Mylae, and a Roman commander named Gaius Duilius has a problem that should get his entire fleet sunk. Rome is at war with Carthage, the dominant naval power in the western Mediterranean. The Carthaginians have been sailors for centuries. Their crews are faster. Their captains know how to ram and maneuver, how to dance around an enemy ship, and punch a hole in its side. The Romans are soldiers. They are the best infantry on earth and almost useless at sea. In a contest of seamanship, Rome loses every time. So Rome refuses to have a contest of seamanship. The Romans bolt a strange device to the front of their ships called the corvus, which means crow or raven. It is a long boarding bridge, hinged at the base of a pole so it can swing and drop in any direction. On the underside of the far end is a heavy iron spike shaped like a beak. When a Carthaginian ship comes close, the Romans release the corvus and it crashes down onto the enemy deck, and the iron beak punches into the planking and locks the two ships together. Now the Carthaginians' superior sailing means nothing, because the ships are nailed to each other and going nowhere. And across that bridge pour Roman legionaries, the best close quarters killers in the world, turning a naval battle into the one thing Rome cannot lose, a land fight that happens to be floating. At Mylae, Duilius wins Rome's first major naval victory this way, and Rome is so stunned to win at sea that they build him a monument decorated with the prows of captured ships. The corvus has one fatal flaw. All that iron at the bow makes the ships dangerously top-heavy, and Rome later loses entire fleets to storms, hundreds of ships swallowed in single tempests. Eventually, they abandon the device. But by then, it has done its job. It has handed Rome the sea. Assyrian siege towers and rams. It's 701 BC at the walls of the city of Lachish in the kingdom of Judah, and the army of the Assyrian king Sennacherib is rolling machines up an artificial mountain to break the city open. We know exactly what this looks like because Sennacherib is so proud of it that he covers the walls of his palace at Nineveh with carved stone reliefs showing the whole siege, and those carvings survive. They are the oldest detailed pictures of siege engineering in the world, and they are terrifyingly sophisticated. The Assyrians are the first people to treat the conquest of a walled city as an engineering project rather than a gamble. They arrive with a corps of specialists. At Lachish, they build a colossal ramp of packed earth and stone, sloping up to the city wall so they can roll heavy equipment right up to the top of the defenses, instead of fighting up ladders. Up that ramp, they push the machines. The Assyrian siege engine is a wheeled wooden frame armored with wet hides and wicker to shrug off fire arrows, and inside it swings a battering ram with a metal-tipped head. But this is not a simple log. The reliefs show the head being used to pry and lever individual stones and bricks out of the wall, picking the masonry apart. And built onto the front of the engine is a tower, a raised platform where Assyrian archers stand level with the defenders and rain arrows down onto the men trying to stop the ram. So in a single machine, you have armor, a ram, and a mobile archer tower, all advancing up a custom-built ramp in the 8th century BC. Lachish falls. Sennacherib deports its population and carves their suffering into his palace as decoration. That is the thread running through every weapon here. Each one is a person, somewhere, refusing to accept the limits of their century. A strategist who turns a crossbow into a machine gun. Steppe riders who fold horn and sinew into a bow that outranges belief. Chinese engineers who build a multi-stage rocket because they want to burn boats. They were not ahead of their time by accident. They were ahead of it because someone decided their time was not good enough and built the future out of wood, bronze, rope, and gunpowder, long before the world was ready to use it.